Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be using the beautiful Peony stamp set by Altenew, and I'm showing you the Weave Builder stencil, which we will be using to create a background, but not for this card. So I'm going to start off by stamping out my images, and I'm going to be using my Misty just to make it a little bit easier. I'm going to be stamping on Neenah Solar Weight 80-pound cardstock, and I'm kind of just playing around with making sure that all of my images fit. I have all of my cardstock pre-cut to an A2 size card, so I just pulled one out. Had a little bit of a hard time kind of fitting these on here and giving myself enough room so that I can die cut them later. I am going to be stamping the flowers with Twirling Tutu ink by Simon Says Stamp, and didn't realize that, or I wasn't thinking, I should say, that I have my leaves on here, and obviously I don't want those to have a pink outline. So I went ahead and removed those leaves and just stamped out the flowers with the Twirling Tutu. And then I will go ahead and stamp out the leaves with Jellybean ink, also by Simon Says Stamp. These are dye inks, and from what I can see anyway, it appears that they are Copic safe, but this will give it a no line coloring look anyway, so it doesn't really matter if the color bleeds just a little bit. So once my images were stamped out, we're going to go ahead and move right on to the coloring. And the coloring took a long time, so I'm not going to show you all of it, and I'm going to kind of speed it up in certain places as well. This is going to be no line. So I'm going to start by filling in the center part of the flower, because this is such a light color and I don't want to lose it as I'm coloring my petals. I'm just filling this in. I'll fix it up later as far as giving it some texture and some dimension, but this is just so that I don't lose it while I'm doing the rest of my coloring. So we're going to jump right into the first flower. And like I said, this is a no line coloring technique. So I color typically one petal at a time, or if I go with more than one petal, they'll kind of be separated from one another. I'm starting off with my lightest color here to map out my darkest areas, and then going in with my darkest color. You can see I'm creating a shadow where this petal is laying underneath other petals, and there's also little notches that are within the illustration, and I'm just using those to my advantage as well to add a little bit more texture to it. Blended that out with my midtones and then my lightest color, and I just wasn't getting the look that I wanted. So I went back in with my darkest color and I extended my flicks up pretty far, and I'm just barely touching the paper with the very tip of my marker, and then I'll flick that out as well as that darkest midtone, and I kind of just left that as is. So now that I kind of know how I want these petals colored, I have a better idea of how much of each color to add. So again, starting off with my lightest color and then the darkest, two midtones, and then the lightest. Each of these petals are shaped completely different from one another. So sometimes you kind of have to take a step back to see how each one of them are shaped to determine how you're going to color, where your shadows are going to be, where your highlights are going to be. If there's any of those little lines or notches within the illustration, I'm using those to my advantage as well, and just flicking out each time, but in the same direction. So if I'm shading off to the left-hand side, like for this one, I'm going to shade with all four colors to the left-hand side so that you don't kind of end up with just a blob. So like I said, I'm going to be doing one petal, maybe two at a time, depending on their location. This one is kind of folded in the middle. So there's going to be one line pretty much that goes right through the center, kind of like a curved line. And again, using that to my advantage, and I'm going to be shading that in the same direction each and every time. And in the end, it will appear as if that petal is bent. Also, sometimes you can't tell what these petals are doing. And sometimes you'll see that I'll take out the packaging of the stamp set so that I can kind of look at it as a whole rather than partially colored, because sometimes that can be confusing too. It also helps that if you're not 100% sure what one particular petal is doing or how it's shaped or where it's supposed to go, color all the ones around it that you know or that are easy, and then you can kind of determine how the next one should be colored. Also, sometimes you still can't tell, even by looking at the stamp set and having all of the other petals colored. And my rule, or what I tell myself, is if I can't tell, the recipient of the card isn't going to be able to tell. They're pretty much going to be looking at the flower as a whole. They're not going to be looking at each and every petal. As long as you have contrast and you are able to differentiate between each and every petal, you're fine. Now here you can see that I've switched over and kind of started off with my darkest color, because I found that my flicks were being blended out too much for this particular flower. And you can certainly go the smoother look, but I wanted those flicks to show because I wanted to add texture to each one of the petals. I find that starting off with the darkest color and then working my way down helps with that, so that you maintain those flicks and you maintain that texture. If you go in with the lightest color, that's already saturating the paper. So your colors will already begin to blend as soon as you put that darkest color down. Even though it may not be too noticeable, as you continue to add color, those flicks are going to slowly disappear. And you can also see that I stopped removing the caps each and every time. So obviously I am sticking with the same color combination for each one of these flowers and each one of these petals, but I'm no longer showing you each one of the caps. I was getting kind of tired of removing the caps each and every time and flipping them so that you guys can see. So if you happen to skip through to this part, rewind it a little bit and you'll see what color combinations I'm using. So I'm just finishing up this flower here, and you can see here's where I'm getting to the point where I'm not really sure what these petals are doing or what direction they're going or if they're folded. So you'll see once I color these outer two, I'll have a better idea of what those two middle ones are doing. And it turns out that it is one petal and it's just kind of flipped over or folded over on itself. And by coloring these two outside ones, it was much easier for me to see that. So again, just adding that darkest color in first, and where the petal is folded over on itself, I do create a shadow for that as well. And when you look at it as a whole, it does appear that the petal is bent. So I'm going to move on to the second flower, and I'm speeding this up even more because I'm pretty much doing the same thing. This one is shaped a little bit different as far as the flower as a whole, but pretty much I'm doing the same thing as far as going in with my darkest color and kind of working my way down. I move the paper around a lot. For me, it's easier to flick away from me, but do whatever works for you. Some people can keep the paper in the same direction each time and flick to the side, flick forward, flick back. I can't, well, I can, but it's just easier for me, and I feel like I have more control when I flick away from me. So that's why I keep twisting and turning my paper, and I'm also twisting and turning a lot because I'm trying to figure out which petal does what direction it's going, where my shading needs to be, where my highlight needs to be, and things like that. And like I said, people are going to look at your card and look at each flower as a flower, not as an individual petal. So I'm also being careful not to go over that center, which is the main reason why I kind of just colored that in solid to begin with. Because if I would have saved this for last, there's a good chance that I would have mistaken this as a petal, because there's so many petals that I'm not sure what they're doing, that I may have colored this in accidentally. Or being I'm using such a light color for the center of the flower, if you happen to touch the red area or the pink area, you're going to drag the color out with the lighter color. And obviously a yellowish marker is a lot lighter than the colors we're using here. So you would end up with a lot of red in the center, even though I will go back and kind of fix the center of the flowers up a little bit. I'm going to be super careful, and I have myself a guide there, being I filled those in first. So I'm just finishing up some of these petals on this particular image, and I'm kind of saving the ones that I'm not sure about for last. I colored the simple ones in first, and here you can see that I am bringing that stamp set or the packaging of the stamp set back out for kind of a guide or a reference. I have it sitting next to me the entire time, but sometimes I have to actually pick it up and kind of lay it over or lay it on top of the image on my paper itself, just to help me figure out what is what. And again, if you can't figure it out, neither can anybody else. So don't stress it. This is a no line look, so you don't have that black outline that's going to kind of mess everything up. No line is actually more forgiving than people may think. It's scary. It's scary for me too sometimes. But if you make a mistake, it's actually easier to cover up because you can just change the shape of the petal. You don't have to have that black outline that forces you to color it a particular way. So I went ahead and finished up this flower, and I colored the other flower off camera. I won't make you watch that one as well. And we're going to fill in or fix up the centers of these flowers. Going to bring in the same colors as I used in the beginning, but I'm also bringing in a shadow color, and I'm just putting little itty bitty tiny flicks, almost little dots, but just flicking them out a little bit on the base of the center of the flower. And then I'll extend that out with the mid-tone and then go back to that lightest color. Again, just doing little tiny dots. This will give it some texture, but it will also make it appear that the centers of the flower are raised up a little bit because that highlight will be right on the top. So once those were done, we will move on to the leaves. And again, just going to show you one set of leaves here because I pretty much did the same thing for all three. Going to go right in with my darkest color, just like I did with my flowers, because I want that texture of my flicks to show through. So for this first one, I am going to start on the bottom where the stem is and add some shading to the base of the leaf as well as the tip of the leaf. And where the leaves are kind of indented in themselves, it's either going to be a line depending on the shape, or sometimes I'm doing just a small little V. For the other two, I'm going to just put some shading on the base of the leaves, but still creating those little V's. And that one leaf is folded over on itself, so that would also create a shadow. I'm extending this out with the YG97, and again, barely touching the paper with just the tip of my marker just to extend these areas out a little bit further, including those little V's that we had created. I'm just making those a little bit longer and kind of going up on the side of the leaf just a little bit more. Same thing with the YG95, and I'm just leaving a highlight for this one right in the center of the leaf, and that will kind of make it look like the leaf is bent a bit. Same thing for the other two leaves, making sure that I extend that shadow where that one leaf is kind of bent on itself. And then finally bringing in the highlight color, and I'm pretty quickly going over the same area because I want to preserve those flick lines and preserve that texture that I had created within the leaves. So once the leaves were colored, I went ahead and die cut those out, and we will move on to the what was going to be the background. So I have another piece of Nina Solar White here, and I'm taking one of the blendability brushes by Trinity Stamps and kind of dabbing that off on my scrap paper, then bringing that very lightly onto my card panel itself. It does not have to be a perfect blend. I just didn't want any white to be showing once I did my ink blending over the stencil. So I'm just going in with a very light hand to make this just kind of like an off-white. Then I will go ahead and take my stencil and line that up onto my card panel. And I just use Post-it note tape on the back of the panel to stick that down on all four sides of the stencil, so that way it doesn't shift around as I'm doing my ink blending. Going back in with the antique linen and just going in with a heavier hand this time and going over the entire card panel. I'm not dabbing this off onto my scrap paper this time because I definitely want this to be different than the rest of my background that I've already created. I wanted this to be, quite a bit darker so that you can actually see it. Once that was done, I removed my stencil, but kept my Post-it note tape there. That way I can reposition my stencil and still have that stick down without having to get new tape because I'm lazy. And there's a couple different ways that you can line the stencil up. And I just kind of shifted it down and lined that up it's very easy to see. As long as you don't have any of that antique linen showing, it's lined up the right way. Going in with the frayed burlap, again, taking another one of the blendability brushes and going over the stencil again, like I said, with a pretty heavy hand to make sure I kind of get into all of those little crevices. Trying to be careful not to touch my card panel itself, just because with the Distress Oxides, they stay wet and it's easy to get fingerprints on them or get your fingers inky. Then you end up with fingerprints in places that you don't want them to be. So I went ahead and removed my stencil and removed that Post-it note tape. And I do love the way the background turned out. And I kind of started arranging my die cut flowers onto the panel, and I wasn't loving it. I wanted my flowers to be the main focus and the coloring on the flowers to be the main focus on the card. And I think the background was just taking away from that too much. So I am going to save this and I will use it for another card, but it will not be for this one. So I ended up taking another piece of the Nina Solar White, and being I have the antique linen and frayed burlap still on my desk, I'm just going to use those again just to do basic ink blending in the background. Starting off with the top left-hand corner, adding a layer of the antique linen, then just adding a little bit of that frayed burlap to just the top corner, and then going back in with the antique linen to kind of blend that out a little bit and fade off to white. So just the top left-hand corner is going to have the ink down. And then I can kind of start arranging my flowers again. And for some reason, I struggle with this when they're die cut. If it was a one-layer card and I was masking, I'd have no problem arranging these flowers. But now that I can kind of move them around and things like that, this is when I actually struggle with them. I did figure that I didn't have enough of my panel enough ink down in order to show through all of the flowers. I did also cut down my panel by 1/4 of an inch on each side, or just the right hand side and the bottom, and I still didn't have enough ink down. So I ended up going back in with the antique linen just to kind of bring that down a little bit further, and then bring that off to the right a little bit further, just so that this shows through a little bit more. Then I went ahead and arranged my flowers again, just paying attention to which ones I'm going to want flat onto the card panel and which ones I'm going to need to pop up. So I removed the ones that are going to need to be popped up and left the ones there that will be flat against the card, and stuck those down with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue. And some of my images there are kind of hanging off the card. That's all right, because I trimmed this down. So it's going to have a border with the note card that I'm going to be using. So it's not going to be hanging off too much the card itself. It will still fit in an envelope. So placing that middle flower back down just for placement on the actually all 3 of the leaves before I stuck those down with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue, adhering that one to the top right directly over the first 2 flowers. I didn't have to pop these up because they were kind of even with one another. So sticking this down flat, it popped up anyway because it's on top of the flowers, but I didn't have to use foam tape. I did use some Scotch foam tape to pop up the middle flower, and I had a little piece showing in kind of where the flowers indented in. So I just kind of stuck my scissors in there and cut out like a little V inside on the foam tape before, and then you can't see it anymore, and I didn't have to try to peel that off. Went ahead and popped that up right there in the center, and then I'm going to go ahead and stamp the sentiment with black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp in the lower right-hand corner. I was trying to move all my flowers to the top left-hand corner, but they ended up kind of going out further than I expected it to. So stamping this more towards the right will kind of offset that. I added first I adhered this down to an A2 size note card. This is a top folding note card, and I adhered this flat down with that same Tombow Mono multi glue. Took my Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen to add shimmer to all 3 of the flowers. I left the leaves as is, and I'm going to be using some of the Dream Drops, and this is Cloud 9, so it's iridescent, but it's more white. It's not totally clear. It's hard to explain. You guys have got to see these things. They're beautiful. But I just dropped a couple of those around the sentiment on either side, and that is it. That is the card for today, guys. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.